Broadcast Amsterdam. Good morning, and this is Broadcast Amsterdam. It's 8:35. We're a little bit later than usual. Joining me on the line, also earlier than usual, because he normally joins us on a Friday, Zack from NL Times. Good morning, Zack.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. Busy night last night.
Well, exactly. We thought we might as well, if you've probably been up all night, we might as well keep you going this morning so our listeners can get an idea of just what's been going on. Because it was quite an extensive list came up last night, wasn't there?
Yeah, it's really a lot that's going on in terms of how the Netherlands is entering into this partial lockdown. It's also been building up over a month or two as several in the political opposition are accusing the cabinet of moving too slowly and blaming them for this sort of blunt set of measures that we have to go into. But yes, everything goes and takes effect from 10 o'clock tonight. From restaurants and bars being closed for 4 weeks to an end to amateur sports competitions again. It's all coming forward. It's all in the forefront again. And coffee shops also, just like last time, are going to be closed except for takeaway. And I know there was a little bit of a run on coffee shops last night. I saw when I was headed home from my office. So.
Well, I know when you first when he mentioned it yesterday, it was like and coffee shops were closed, and it was like everyone pricks up their ears. Oh, what's going on? But then in the next breath, it was that takeaway will be allowed, and I think we saw that the first time round. Initially, it was just going to be everything closed, and within 24 hours, they were allowing coffee shops.
Yeah, they rolled it back real quick last time. But we've got this rule now. That's actually going to be enforced that no more gatherings of no more than 30 people in indoor areas where people are seated. And the government said they're going to enforce that extremely strictly. Outside of a home, groups of people can only comprise of up to 4 people and from mixed households. So if you're in a household together, fine. But, if you're all living together, but if you're not in a household together, it's a maximum of 4 of you together in any place. And you're being told we're all being told we can't have more than 3 guests in our home on any given day. And that means, you can't have 3 guests now and then 3 guests an hour from now. Yeah. We're not, which I have friends who were staggering, birthday parties in that way where, they were trying to skirt the rules by saying, okay, well, I'll have 3 people visit for cake now.
Well, I think
and 3 people visit for cake in the afternoon.
Yeah. And I think it wasn't even that clear that it was trying to skirt the rules before because
exactly.
It was just like, you can have 3 people. Okay. We can stagger them in that case. I know people who had a housewarming party and did exactly the same thing, tried to stagger people's arrival. But,
right, and I was trying to explain to a friend of mine yesterday who was planning on organizing their weekend that way with these little groups of people, and I said, well, you better hope you don't get infected because then you're sort of the Trump of the group. You become the super spreader.
No, absolutely, and I think exactly. I've seen comments already today as well. People are saying, "Oh well, we didn't mention the churches, we didn't do this. The schools are still happening, all of that." But it's just adding a hindrance, isn't it? Just to make it a little bit more difficult, to make us think twice about going
right.
there.
So schools are staying in. There were no more restrictions on schools that were placed, and that's because the cabinet simply said education is just too important. It's too important to keep the schools open. It's too important to keep students in a regular learning environment. My suspicion is that if restrictions get tightened up further, that it starts with the older kids first and then works its way down if things don't work. Yeah. Older kids are, older children, 16, 17, 18 or high school students are able to fend for themselves to the point where, they're more able to sit at home and run their class day themselves online. Whereas, kids in group 1 or 2, so, 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds are certainly unable to do that. A parent needs to be with them throughout the day. We'll see if that happens with schools eventually. But for right now, the cabinet said definitely nothing with schools. But they definitely do want to make face masks mandatory, which is, a huge about face for this government. Mm-hmm. 6 months ago, for the last 6 months, they've gone on and on about how they don't think face masks are effective. And now they want to make face masks mandatory and have realized that they don't have the legal ability to do so, and are trying to figure out how to adapt the law in the Netherlands to be able to make face masks obligatory.
Well, exactly. You get the impression that they still aren't a major fan of them, that it does feel a bit like they're bowing to international political pressure on this one.
Yeah, and I've read some criticism of one of the studies that the RIVM points to for saying that face masks are not effective, and it was a Scandinavian study. I can't remember which country. And basically it looked at the effectiveness of using face masks when there was very low transmission of the virus. So the number of incidences of coronavirus infections was very low. And it doesn't really reflect the situation that the Netherlands is in right now, where we're one of the worst, if not the worst offender per capita in terms of the number of new infections on a daily basis.
Yeah, of course, if people had stuck to the distancing, that wouldn't be it wouldn't be an issue because, as the Dutch government have also pointed out, most of the measurements for face masks have been taken very close to the face mask, where actually if you're distancing, you should be measuring that at 1.5 meters away. Of course, people can't always do that, and that's why people are saying that's why you need a face mask. So it's swings and roundabouts.
Well, so there's you're hitting on two different points there that are both important discussion topics, and one is that Hugo de Jonge, the Minister of Health, yesterday during the press conference said quite simply that the fastest way to lift the restrictions is by following the restrictions. And he said that also as a criticism of, our collective inability to follow many of the restrictions and many of the pieces of advice that have been handed down to us over the past 6 weeks. So that's one. And then the other issue is that political opposition groups and also, we're going to start seeing business associations saying the same thing also, I suspect, believe that the cabinet was way too slow in putting in new measures in the first place, that they disappeared for too long over the summer, that there was too long of a hold between press conferences, that the first measures that were introduced in September were very, very weak and half-hearted and were not taken seriously. And the second set of measures felt more like an advisory than regulation. This was also criticism from our own audience. This was criticism from the entrepreneur communities, which we as a company participate in. And I think the cabinet is going to bear the brunt of some of that criticism in Parliament when this is debated later today.
Well, yeah, and I think you mentioned how people weren't necessarily taking the earlier restrictions seriously. I think that's also reflected the viewing figures are out already for the press conference last night, and they were saying 7.2 million people watched it. The previous one was like 6 million, and the one before that was nearer the 3 million. So clearly, interest is getting up. And if only 3 million people watched the first lot, then you understand why it wasn't necessarily taken as seriously as hopefully this time round when we've just had 7 people. That's nearly half the country, let's face it.
Yeah, and just as an indicator, also, that's just who watched it on broadcast, right? So that doesn't include the people who watched the YouTube live stream that NOS put up or the Facebook live stream that the Prime Minister put up. Or just our rolling coverage of it as well, and also our competitor Dutch News and Dutch Review and how they covered it. These figures don't calculate that in.
No, and all the Facebook reposts and YouTube and everything else which is on there. This is just NPO1, RTL, and SBS. That's the only thing.
Right, and for our indication, this was probably the most read, I would say, or the most followed story regarding coronavirus since the first press conference, or since the Prime Minister's speech, that sit-down speech that he gave behind his desk in March, or even that very first press conference when the first set of restrictions were put in, the intelligent lockdown, so to speak. For us yesterday, this was the first time in 7 months that our server almost crashed because of the heavy traffic load. To us, that showed, both how many people were on the site at once, but also how many people kept hitting refresh so they could quickly see whatever the next update was. This was definitely probably the most followed press conference, I would say, since March.
Well, I mean, for that percentage of an audience of any population to watch a TV program is quite phenomenal, actually. That's regardless who's talking. It's certainly got people's interest this time round. So. Yeah,
and these rules and restrictions, they affect quite a bit. I know you've touched on the main points throughout the day, but just to recap some of them, food and beverage locations, restaurants and cafes and bars are completely closed, with the exception of takeaway. No alcohol takeaway or consumption on the street or soft drug consumption on the street is allowed after 8 o'clock at night. Businesses that serve food and drinks but also provide other services have to close their whole catering areas. These are things that are going to affect a huge proportion of businesses, and it's not clear what financial support is going to be there for them yet. No. Likewise, all events are outlawed. We're not allowed to have any events anymore except for food markets. For some reason, trade shows and conferences get an exemption, as if people are really, as if somehow the virus doesn't spread at trade shows and conferences. So I was pretty mystified by that.
Which only tend to be international as well, of course. So.
Right. Culture. We're lucky that some of our cultural locations get to stay open. These are the ones where you go in and there's a flow of traffic. So you're not standing in one place, but you're kind of moving through a museum, for example. So at least those get to stay open, but only on reservation. And you have to book a time in advance. You can't just drop in.
So you can't just. So that means basically, if you want to go, if you think, oh hey, we haven't been to the Rijksmuseum, it's been ages. Are you going to have to make an appointment with the Rijksmuseum, or can you still go along to that?
Yes, that is the intention. Is that you'll have to book a time slot.
Okay.
Sports participation, so amateur sports for adults, is gone. For at least a month. These are amateur sports trainings where you get closer than 1.5 meters to somebody else. Those are canceled. Groups of more than 4 adults training together are not allowed, even if they're on the same team together.
Yeah, I think he also gave last night. He gave, just to interrupt. Sorry, he gave the example of tennis, saying that doubles tennis would probably be okay because it's just one of you on each side of the court. But if you got to singles tennis would be okay. But if you got to doubles tennis, there's 2 of you on the same side. You'll crash into each other. That's not distancing. So it's literally down to think about what you're doing. It's not just about these are the rules. These are the maximum allowed. Maximum doesn't mean you have to do it. It's like a speed limit. Just because it says 50 kilometers now, you don't have to go at 50 kilometers. You can go less.
Yeah, and even though some sports are allowed, of course, showers and changing locker rooms and canteens are all closed. And there are some exceptions for children under 18. They're allowed to participate in competitions within their own team or within their own club. So if you've got 2 teams under the same club, they can play a match against each other, but they can't play a match against another club's team.
So that's even for little kids, because I saw that it was different for small kids under the age of 18 is not all that small, but for younger kids,
it doesn't. That's something that will have an impact on let's say children under 12. But it has a much bigger impact for children who are around 16 or 17 and play in higher level youth competitions.
Well, and also at that age, they're starting to get onto junior teams of the big league as well. If they really stand out, absolutely. So.
Yeah, and then restrictions on travel. It was reiterated not to go to code red or code orange countries that get this designation of do not go under any circumstances or only go for necessary trips. That's the difference between red and orange. There's still people who aren't following that. We're looking at around 400 to 600 people in every week who come down with an infection within 2 weeks of traveling. And so I think the government is concerned about that as well. Not concerned enough where they're like shutting the airports or closing the bus terminals or something like that. But I think there is a concern about people bringing the infection back to the Netherlands from other countries now.
Yeah. I don't want to say it, But what about the holiday season? Because that's just around the corner as well.
Yeah, this is one of those cases of your guess is as good as mine, and I wouldn't book anything non-refundable.
Yeah, I am.
If I was booking a hotel, even a hotel stay within the Netherlands, right now, I would only book it where I have to pay when I show up.
Yeah.
I would not be booking, trying to get 50 euros off by paying for it up front. Because I think the reality of the situation is, first, that it's very bad in terms of infections. It's very bad in terms of hospitalizations, or it's going down that road. We're tracking the likelihood of 2,000 COVID hospital patients by, I think, Tuesday. So within a week.
Yeah.
We've seen hospitalizations double in the last 2 weeks, and they've increased tenfold in the last 6 weeks. I wouldn't be so quick to make any holiday plans.
No, I think your statistic on your site, I believe it's at the start of your report, is basically in the last, or one of the reports anyway, I read on your site, in the last 3 days, we've now seen the same number of infections or more than in the total month of August.
That's correct. We've seen more.
Phenomenal.
And it's entirely possible that by the end of this week, there will have been more infections for all of October than all of September, which itself was a record.
And that is why these restrictions are being put in place, right?
Yeah, and that's why the government, that's why the Prime Minister and the Health Minister flat out said that they were meant to be a blunt hammer to crush the number of infections. They feel like now's the time that they need to act blunt and not with precision. They suggest that they were acting with precision over the last 2 months by allowing security regions to establish their own restrictions, but certainly. Both the health minister and prime minister said it was clear that the regional restrictions are not what's needed right now.
Well, I think the theory of that does sound right, because if you want precision, it's about being precise for that little area. That's exactly what the precision was. But if it wasn't working, absolutely.
And then if we go back to a system of, which they've introduced this roadmap of 4 different levels and what restrictions you can expect when the security region in which you live is at one of the different 4 high risk levels, right? And perhaps the problem with that, or what that doesn't foresee, is that the Netherlands is a small country. It's divided into these 25 security regions. The Randstad alone is made up of, I think, 10 of these different security regions, including the province of Utrecht. And people tend to travel quite a bit across these regional borders, and so too does the virus travel with them. So I think it'll be very heated in Parliament today, debating whether or not regional restrictions work, whether or not the government acted fast enough, whether or not this theory of different risk levels for different parts of the country makes sense. Should there be 25 security regions is maybe another question that we should be looking at.
Well, exactly. And should they just be fixed to the provinces instead, possibly?
Exactly, because we have twice as many of these security regions as we have provinces. And, already 12 provinces for such a small country seems like kind of a lot in some cases as well.
Yep, no, absolutely. So we'll have to see what they do with that, but that's a whole other issue, reorganizing the country's political structure. That might take some doing. That might not be one on the back of an envelope on a corona crisis, that one.
Right, but as it stands right now, we have, on the scale of 1 to 4, we have 8 security regions that are at this, the most serious level. Yeah. One is in Brabant, the rest are in the Randstad. We have nearly all of the other security regions are at a serious level, which means that they have more than 150 infections per capita. I think in a day or in a week, if memory serves. And then the rest of the country is at the worrying level, which I think is 3 different.
And in that worrying area, because that's basically outside the Randstad, they tend to be more religious, and yet there's been no changes to church congregation rules or anything like that at the moment. They're also still exempt, right?
Well, so they're still allowed to have groups of more than 30. This was very controversial just 2 weeks ago when you had a church in Staphorst that said that they were going to hold services for 600 people because their church is large enough to handle that. And they weren't making people mask up, and they were allowing people to sing. Singing for months has been one of the things that the government said you absolutely should not do in public. Because it increases the distance that the virus can travel.
Well, yeah, you breathe more deeply. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also it gets into a legal complication over whether or not you can enforce such a restriction on a church, or if it's got to be more like a carrot and a stick scenario where you have to encourage the church to do it, and otherwise, give them a whack with a ruler on the hands. We'll just have to see how that plays out. I think our audience was surprised. I was surprised. At the same time, I do understand that there's legal complications to the face masks, to limiting the rights of demonstrators and protests, and to limiting the rights of religious services. Yeah. Also, funeral homes are allowed to serve food, and funeral homes get some exemptions as well. And, I was a little bit surprised by that, too. It's unfortunate, and it's disappointing that there may have to be restrictions on funeral services. But, that's kind of the life that we're in right now.
That's what it comes to. Exactly. All right, Zack, thank you very much for your time this morning. I hope that's been a real use to our listeners. It certainly has been to me.
All right. Well, I'm glad I could help. Stay tuned. Stay tuned to your show in the mornings and to nltimes.nl for all of the information on what's going on in the Netherlands with regard to the coronavirus.
Broadcast Amsterdam.
Broadcast Amsterdam, your local radio station, 24/7 and on demand. Or on broadcastamsterdam.nl.